Thank you all for attending today. Today, Christian Hyatt, CEO here at Risk 360, he'll be covering how to build a security program, covering the maturity roadmap and how to build it out for your organization. Thank you all for attending, and please, if you have any questions, feel free to fill out the question section, and we'll get to them at the end. Christian, you take it from here.
Awesome. Thanks, Corey. So Corey already mentioned it, but a couple admin items. So first of all, thank you everybody for joining. I really appreciate it. Excited about what we're going to cover today. Going to talk about the security program roadmap. We'll talk about budgets, and then we'll also talk about if you need to communicate all of that to your team, how do you do that? And we'll provide some templates along the way. We also will close for questions, and I'll answer them to the best of my ability. So if you have questions along the way, throw them in the chat. I love that. It's interactive. It helps us get engaged and know what you guys care about. Corey's also going to throw some of the templates or the links to the templates as we go into the chat if we have them available. So just kind of watch out for that for resources as we go. If you're watching this on YouTube later, we'll put all those links in the description of this video so that you can grab them there too. So it looks like everybody's joining. We're right on time here. So let me talk a little bit about me and about Risk 360 so you know who I am and who Risk 360 is. So I'm the CEO and co-founder of Risk 360. A lot of the folks joining today are Risk 360 clients, so thank you for joining and welcome. But if you don't know who Risk 360 is, what we do for organizations is a couple of different things. One, we audit organizations, so we'll do security assessments or we'll help them obtain a certification. And then the other thing that we do is we help organizations build security programs, or we manage the security program on their behalf, or the GRC program on their behalf. The reason that is important is because we see security programs from both the auditor's perspective, but also from the perspective of helping build them and manage them ourselves. So as part of that process, we've seen hundreds of security programs and we've helped build hundreds of security programs, and we've turned that into playbooks. And that's really where a lot of this whole series comes into play, is we're just revealing that playbook so that you guys can use the tools that we use successfully to build out security programs for yourselves. So for a little bit of context, let me talk about who I think you are in the audience that we're trying to talk to, make sure this resonates with you. So most of the folks who are joining are GRC professionals, they're leading compliance programs, or they're security professionals, and you guys have experience. You've either built security programs or you're managing one yourselves, and you already have good opinions and processes. So this is intended to be a supplement to all of that. Most of you already have a security program, and you're either looking to mature that existing security program, or maybe some of you have the fortunate position to be able to build a security program from scratch, and you'll be able to use this whole playbook to do that. So what I'd like to do through this whole series is systematize some of that, make it repeatable, give you some tips and some tools and some guidance, and share what has worked for us in terms of how you can get started for yourself, some of the templates so you don't have to recreate those from scratch, and then give you some confidence just so that you know you aren't missing anything, that you've seen the way other people are doing it, and you can sanity check your own processes and implement what makes sense for you. I did mention this is a 4-part series, so if you haven't tuned into the other parts, we'll link to those in the description here. So what we've already done is part 1 was planning and vision setting. I did a whole video on how to plan a security program, how to gather requirements and set a vision and communicate the vision. You can check that out on YouTube. It's in the playlist. This second part of the series is the maturity roadmap. So we'll talk about that today. Coming up next, we'll talk about how to operate it. We'll talk about key program pillars and the different work streams of a security program. And then we'll finalize this series with how to get your program certified if you want to. So just so you have a sense for where we're going today and how we're going to get there. If you're thinking of timing, so this is a good opportunity to grab a screenshot. Having implemented a lot of programs, most companies have some goals to do it with a calendar year. This is a typical calendar of how this would go as we're building it out from a month-by-month process. So if you're communicating this to your board or thinking for yourself, how should these activities happen? Good screenshot opportunity how you could get this done in 12 months. And again, today we're at that maturity roadmap, which I usually say give yourself 90 to 120 days to do that. So let's dive into the tactics of today. So there's 4 main things that I want to talk about when it comes to building a maturity roadmap. So first, we're going to talk about choosing a security framework. That's something that always comes out like, all right, I want I want to measure my security program, but which framework should I use and why? So we'll talk about that. Then we'll talk about the tactics of actually doing a maturity assessment itself, and we'll dive into some tools and some examples of how you can do that. Then once you've done that maturity assessment, we'll talk about how to align a budget to that, and I'll give you a budget example. We'll review example, there's a template. And then lastly, we'll talk about if you need to communicate all of that to stakeholders like the board of directors or executive leadership team, what could that look like? We'll walk through an example and then also give you a template for that as well. So that's our journey for today. And we're going to start off with choosing that framework. So there's really 4 considerations when you're choosing a security framework. So almost any time that we walk into an organization and they tell us that they want to do a security program maturity roadmap, the very first question that we start off with is, well, what do you want to align to? Do you want to align to NIST, ISO, SOC 2, and why would you want to align to those things? So if you're doing that analysis for yourself, I think there's a few things to consider. And then probably the number one thing that most organizations consider off the bat is your existing compliance requirements. So if you already have an ISO objective, like you have to get ISO 27001 certified, or you have to do SOC 2 or HIPAA or GDPR, you absolutely want to integrate those into your maturity assessment. A lot of times, especially if you're a new CISO, maybe you're comfortable with one framework. So maybe you're really comfortable with NIST, but the organization doesn't have a need for NIST at all. They align to ISO, their clients want ISO and SOC 2. So it might make more sense in those instances to choose a different framework based on your familiarity with it, or based on your company's need rather than your familiarity with it. The other thing is to consider industry best practices. So for example, if you're in healthcare, you almost assuredly need to align to something like HIPAA. Or maybe you're going to choose a NIST framework that maps to HIPAA, or maybe you have to do high trust. If you're in processing payments, maybe you need to do PCI. So consider those industry best practices. The third thing I would consider is if your organization has multiple compliance requirements. So maybe you have to be SOC 2, ISO, you have to communicate GDPR. Maybe there's a framework that you can choose that will help you harmonize all of those control sets with one unified single framework strategy. For me, I think ISO is a good one, for example, to align there. And then lastly, think about what's practical. Based on your business objectives, what's going to make the most sense from a cost and effort perspective? Because if you're a small business, you probably don't want to choose a huge framework like NIST 853. Maybe something like CIS makes sense. Conversely, if you're a very large, complex organization with a lot of risk, you wouldn't want to choose the lightest possible framework. You might need something more robust that covers your particular risk. Another screenshot opportunity. So I kind of went through the different popular frameworks and thought through what industry do they most align to. Are they practical, meaning they're easy to interpret? The results that you get from them are actionable. You can actually go do something with them. Are they cross-compatible, meaning that you can map across other frameworks fairly easily? And what is the cost and effort associated with implementing that framework? Because that might be a big consideration for your organization. So I'll just walk through one of them. So you take ISO. It's applicable to a lot of industries. It's international, fairly practical in nature. It's cross-compatible. You can map across multiple frameworks, or you can adopt a custom control set for ISO 27001. And then cost to implement it is, I would say, moderate. It's kind of middle of the road in terms of effort and monetary cost to implement that type of framework. So grab a screenshot of this. This might help aid in your analysis if you're trying to sanity check which framework to choose. So if you have done that, if you've done that hard work of choosing the framework, the next step is actually doing the security assessment. So if you've chosen the right framework, it does align to your business objectives that you've set forth. It's helping the organization accomplish the mission that you need to accomplish. And you also can explain that decision to stakeholders. That's an important consideration. So if you're going to present this later to the board or your boss or whoever else it might be, and you choose ISO 27001 or you choose NIST 853, being able to articulate back to them using a table like the one we just covered is a helpful way to help them understand the rationale behind choosing that framework, and you can get support for that selection. So that's the first step, choose that framework. So once you've chosen a framework, we're going to hop into doing the maturity assessment. Thinking through doing the maturity, so why would you do the maturity assessment in the first place? So from my experience, CISOs have a few questions that they need to ask, especially security leaders that are new to an organization, or maybe there's some reason the organizations chose to invest in security. And what they're trying to answer for most organizations is, what is the current state? Where are we now? Once you understand where you're at, then you can say, this is where we want to get to. So this is where we're going, and then present a plan to get there. So it's really a storytelling tool so that you can communicate to the board of directors, your executive team for resources, and tell them how you're going to help them get to where you need to do. So that is why most CISOs choose to do a maturity assessment. Most organizations are doing the full-blown maturity assessment every few years, and then in between they're doing something like a reassessment to see if progress has been made. But that is the most important reason that CISOs and security leaders choose to do the maturity assessment. It's really a tool to communicate to that executive team. So if you're an emerging security leader, maybe you're about to take your first CISO role, or you're about to lead a team for the first time, this is a really important step for you to follow, is to do that maturity assessment. When it comes to maturity assessments, I think there's basically 5 concepts. So, and we'll talk through each of these in depth. There's doing the assessment itself. So you need to go through how are you going to do an assessment? What's the blocking and tackling of actually executing a security assessment and getting good results back? Then you need to prioritize the gaps. So doing an assessment, you're going to have findings. There are going to be things you're doing and there's things you're not doing. We have to prioritize, because maybe you have 100 gaps. Which one of those do you do something about? Which ones do you not do something about? And why did you choose that? Then once you prioritize those gaps, you need to build action plans and get buy-in to take action. So for example, if one of your gaps is you don't have policies, well, the resolution plan there is to write the policies, but you need to get buy-in from the people responsible for doing that, or maybe you need to implement a tool and so on. Then you get into this process of tracking all those gaps until they're actually done, because it's one thing to just lay all the gaps on the table and walk away. It's another thing to have a system in place to track them all down and make sure it gets done. And then lastly, I'll show you in our tool Phalanx, because a lot of our existing customers are on here. Maybe you're looking for a platform or a way to do this outside of Excel. I'll show you how we actually do it at Risk 360 and why we do it the way we do. And hopefully that will give you some context of how you want to approach it. And then we also have some downloadable templates that you can use to do all of this yourself. One thing I want to mention is, if you're thinking about that system of do the gap assessment, identify gaps, track all the gaps to final remediation, I did a very detailed video about a system to do that, about how you can process that whole thing and the project management system that you want to create to do that. It's on YouTube, you can get to it. So if you use this QR code or check it out on YouTube, you'll be able to watch that video. I would highly recommend it. I think it's a direct companion to this section of the video. So let's talk about doing the assessment. There's a couple considerations when you're doing assessment. So number one is, are you going to do a self-assessment, meaning like you're going to do it yourself for your organization, or a member of your team is going to do it for your organization, or are you going to leverage a third party? And there's pros and cons to each of those. So for example, you might do a self-assessment because your team has the competence to do it. Maybe your team already has the trust inside the organization, and the organization is going to trust your results, and you have the capacity. So you have the time in the day outside of your normal day job to do an assessment that is thorough. But a lot of organizations choose to engage a third party. I mean, that's why Risk 360 is in business. And the reason organizations often choose to engage a third party is because they either don't have the expertise in-house, maybe they have the expertise, but they don't have the time to do it, or they need the credibility of an outside party. They need someone independent of the function to come in and arrive at an opinion. That way it's less biased, they know it's accurate, the board of directors trust it, your executive team trust it, and also you just get an outside opinion. Someone who didn't build the thing is looking at the thing. So consider that, is a self-assessment right, or should you be engaging a third party? And then the second question is, well, how are you going to do it? Should you do it in Excel? I'll show you how you can do it in Excel. I have an example, there's a template we'll give you. Or should you be doing it in a tool, like a GRC platform, like Phalanx GRC, our tool, to help guide that process? So that's a good consideration, and I'll show you how you could do both here in just a minute. And then the last piece of it is thinking about the level of assurance versus the level of effort. And what I mean by that is how much time and effort are you going to put your organization through to arrive at a result that you feel comfortable with? So some of the extremes are you only ask questions. Or actually, the most extreme is you just answer yourself. Like you don't even talk to anybody. You don't do walkthroughs. You just use your own knowledge and intuition and fill out a gap assessment to arrive at a high-level gap assessment. The benefit of doing that is that it's fast and you don't have to burden the organization by asking questions. So that's good. But the bad part is it's probably really inaccurate. Or maybe you're making a ton of assumptions or you're just flat out wrong about some of the things that you think are in place. So your maturity assessment is wrong. A middle of the road approach is to do walkthroughs. You go through and you just do walkthroughs with the different stakeholders, get their understanding of the current state, and then arrive at your conclusion. The benefit of that is at least you're getting an outside perspective and you're getting people telling you how things are. The downside is it's still likely inaccurate because either they're telling you things that's inaccurate. In certain cases, they're flat out misrepresenting it because they don't want to get in trouble or come across as not doing their job well, or they're wrong. They think something's in place and it's not. It's better than just using your own best guess, but it's not as high of assurance as I would recommend. The way we go about it at Risk 360 is we actually do evidence-based assessments. So everything that someone tells us is in place, they have to provide us evidence to back that up. Especially in your first year, when you're kind of doing that maturity assessment, in my opinion, you want a pretty high level of assurance because there's a lot on the line here. You're going to bring that information to the board of directors. You're going to use that information to build a budget. And you want to have as accurate of a picture of the current state as possible to guide your decisions over the next 36 months as you build out a budget and build out a program. So make those kind of decisions for yourself and then proceed accordingly. The second thing, in a minute, I'll show you, we're actually going to dive into an example here in a minute, but I'll walk through these and we'll dive into the example. So the second thing that you want to think through is prioritizing gaps. So once you've done the whole security assessment and you have all of these gaps, how do you go, what's a systematic way to go about prioritizing them? So some of the things that I consider is one, risk. So let's take our policy gap. You don't have policies. Well, what is the risk of not having policies? Well, maybe that's a high risk because that guides the organization. Next, consider the cost to correct it. Well, maybe that's a low cost financially because it's just effort, but it's high effort. And there's dependencies because you have to work across the organization. And that will help you start rationalizing all those gaps and prioritize them in order of criticality. We have something called a project management module and a risk register module in our tool Phalanx. I will show you that just so you have a sense for what that looks like. And also you can use some of those same exact concepts in like an Excel spreadsheet. And again, I told you already, I would provide you that Excel spreadsheet. But these are some of the foundational concepts when you're prioritizing, and more, almost as important, when you're communicating to someone else how you arrived at those prioritization decisions. Once you've prioritized those gaps, you want to build action plans and get buy-in. So what I see a lot of security practitioners do is they will write the recommendations in the action plans. So for example, the gap is we don't have security policies. The action plan is we'll write security policies and we will do that by end of year. Well, often the step that gets skipped is that the person who actually needs to write them. So let's say you have an engineering policy gap, that SDLC doesn't have a policy. Well, it's not appropriate for you to sign them up for work. You have to go through the hard step of getting the owner of that control to agree to write that policy and agree to a due date to write it. And your role is really the accountability partner, but they're the owner. So don't forget to do that. And that's, policies are an easy example, but if you find something like access control and there's 100 systems, or you're designing a network and there's security gaps in the way your network architecture works, there's often a lot of stakeholders involved. So clarifying who the actual owner is, who's responsible for doing that, and who's going to do the tactical work and building a project plan to actually fix it can be very complex. It can result, and often it will result in a standalone project of itself with a sub work stream. But consider that very carefully as you're thinking through action plans. Don't take that upon yourself. Make sure that you collaborate. And then gets the hard work of actually project managing all of these gaps until they're done. So again, I referenced that video I showed you earlier. We'll talk in depth about the project management aspect and working through gaps. But one of the most important things you can do in terms of tracking is knowing who's responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed for each gap. So to continue off of our policy example, the responsible party for the policy writing might be an engineer, the person who does the SDLC. He's doing the work. The accountable party might be the CTO. That's who can assign the resources, and they ultimately own the outcome of that policy being created. Maybe you as the security practitioner can give advice, so you're consulted. And then the risk council or the executive team is informed as that policy is created. But from a project management perspective, you need to know all of that information across all of your gaps to actually see it forth. And then you're also going to create a cadence of accountability. For example, maybe you have a weekly project management status meeting or something similar to keep those gaps rolling, keep resolution happening, keep the whole team abreast of how things are progressing. So make sure you have that cadence of accountability. This whole project management tracking till done section, watch that other video. I'll cover it in great depth. I think it's a great resource. We'll link to that in the description so you have it. But just keep in mind that part of the maturity assessment is this tracking process. All right, so let me go through an example here. So we talked at a high level some of the different steps. Now I want to dive into detail and talk about how we do it at Risk 360. And you don't have to do it this way, but I think it will give you some great principles to how you could apply these principles in your own environment and use these lessons to be very effective. So let me hop in here. I'm going to change screens. So the way we do it at Risk 360 is we actually use our own platform to do it. So you can do the same stuff in Excel. I'll show you an Excel example here in just a minute. But we use our platform called Phalanx. So this is just Phalanx dashboard. In Phalanx, we have a module called the assessments module. So in the assessments module, I have here an ISO 27001 example. So maybe your organization has a goal to do a maturity assessment and maybe even to achieve ISO certification, and that's the framework that you've chosen to align to. Well, first of all, you need to know what all those requirements are so you can check your organization against them. So in Phalanx, we have templates for all the different frameworks, ISO 27001 being one of those, and there's controls for each of them. And if you click one of the controls, you have to think through. So, all right, one of ISO's requirements, for example, is that you have a statement of applicability. Well, what is a statement of applicability? Why is it required? How do I know if I have one? What's the type of evidence that I would need to see? And you can use the framework. So you could use ISO 27001, ISO 27002, or in our platform, we have all of that information built out. But as you're doing the assessment for yourself, you're going to have to think through, well, how do I test this for my organization? And then what we do is at Risk 360, at least, is for every piece of it, we do two things. We do walkthroughs on every single control that is required with the relevant stakeholder. And then we also require a piece of evidence. So our clients upload that evidence. So here you'll see evidence files into this thing, and we'll review the evidence, mark it as complete or returned, and we'll write up the results of the testing for each control. So that helps us get a pretty good bit of assurance on how something is done in our organization. So I'll click over here to controls testing real quick, just so you can see what that looks like as this loads. So organizational context is clause 4.1. Here's the control, and here's how we're going to test it and our results of testing. So that's how we go about it. No matter how many controls, whether it's NIST 853, whether it's ISO 27001, we do walkthroughs, we have test procedures, and then we require evidence, we review that evidence, and then we validate it. So that's what we do. And I recommend you do the same thing, whether you do it in a platform or not. And in Phalanx, one of the things it does is it gives us dashboards. So when we produce a report, maybe we want to report on how mature ISO is by each section, the gaps and no gaps. So it gives us lots of cool little dashboards in here. So you'll have to think about it. We'll talk about this in the communication section. As you're doing your assessment, how is that going to translate to communication to your team? The other thing we talked about was the project management element of it. So you're either going to have an Excel dashboard with all the gaps and then the status of the project, or or something like that. If you're a Phalanx customer, you're considering a platform, what we do is once we find a gap, we put that gap here in Phalanx. So in this case, they don't have an information security management system, so they have to develop an information security management system. We have some references and policy examples in platform. We've got some training videos in platform that they can watch, and then we give them some information about how that's actually going to be audited. And you can see that we've prioritized this as an extreme priority for ISO because it's mandatory for ISO. The status is that it's on track. We have a start date, due date, and an owner. And if we open this one up, we can kind of glance through what they're going to do. So their description, their action plan, how many hours it's going to take, start and end dates. And that gives us some really neat tools, like if we want to create a Gantt chart, we want to start getting into project management cadences to track this, or if we want dashboards to start tracking some of this. So start thinking about that stuff for yourself. That's how we do it at RIS360. So if you just kind of want to take a cue from us and think through those things in the head or use this platform yourself, you can, but start thinking about how that's going to make sense for you. Now, we do have an Excel template here I want to give you guys. So if you want to try to do this in Excel, I have created an assessment that you can go through, self-score yourself. It has all the controls in it, and I've pre-built some dashboards that you can try to use for your future reports. So if you use this QR code, or if you go to ris360.com/whitepaper, you'll see a bunch of free downloads, and this is one of them. It's our security assessment template, so you can download that as a starting point. So that's doing the maturity assessment piece of it. Remember your outcomes for doing that maturity assessment. One, you want an accurate understanding of the current state. So how much assurance do you need? Can you be inaccurate and it's okay, or do you need a lot of accuracy? I always recommend more accuracy, especially that first year. You got to get buy-in from the owners of the gaps and the controls. You need to create an action plan based on those gaps that are appropriately prioritized. You need to be able to communicate all of that to others effectively. And you need to make sure that everyone's on the same page and ready to move forward. And if you can do all that as part of your maturity assessment, it's going to put you in a great position to start thinking about how you're going to fund all the activities that need to happen to start building that budget. So that'll move us to the budget piece of this. So what happens when you need to build a budget? So I think there's a couple things I would think about when it comes time to building a budget and thinking about how you're going to fund your security roadmap. So one is you need to be able to make budget requests that make sense for the organization, which in of itself means that you need to think about return on investment. You need to be able to make business cases. You need to help your management team effectively make either go or no-go decisions on each project. And you owe it to your organization to help them plan ahead, because they're thinking about what they need to get done over the next 12 to 36 months. And if you have big line items that they need to account for, it's your job as that security leader, or if you're supporting a security leader, to give them that information. So that's what we want to do. That's why designing that budget matters. Three things that I typically think about when it comes to designing a security budget for my maturity roadmap is one, just having the right mindset. And what I mean by that is this isn't you against your own company. You're not just trying to get as much budget as you can. You're really trying to go into it with positive intent, doing what's right for your organization, considering carefully that there could be competing priorities, that you want to be judicious with the spend, but accurate with it. So have the right mindset going into it with your organization. I know a lot of CISOs and just a lot of leaders outside of security need to play games at their organization. Like they have to ask for twice as much as they actually need because they're anticipating just a cut right off the bat. I discourage that kind of behavior and really try to go into it authentically with the right mindset, trying to help the organization. I also think that you need to know your company's process, and we'll talk about some things to consider when how you might need to approach it at your organization to get a budget approved and created. And then I want to walk through our security budget. So I have a template that I've talked about, and I'll walk through that. So at least you have some things to consider for yourself, or if you download this one later, you can use it yourself. So we talked a little bit about right mindset. So I won't touch on this too much, but again, just remember to do what's right for your company. and have the courage to have those hard conversations with your leadership team and with your own team, because you owe it to them, and it's going to make you look like a true leader if you're willing to do that. Sometimes it feels really strange to talk about money, or maybe you've never talked about money before, or maybe there's a little bit of insecurity about like how much is an appropriate amount to ask for. And I would just encourage you to have an open and frequent and ongoing conversation about funding your security requirements in alignment with those business objectives, so that you can do what's right for your company, and that your CFO and the rest of your organization and whoever else you're collaborating with like IT and others, become partners in this process of creating a budget. Because security budgets are notoriously, I would say, unclear, because there's so many line items, so many stakeholders. It's kind of hard to understand. Is it an IT budget, or is it a security budget, or is it the legal team's budget? Is it the compliance team's budget? So it takes a lot of collaboration. So just go in with it with that mindset, and I think you'll be very successful. In terms of knowing your company's process, there's a few things that I would highly encourage you to do your homework on in advance of making budget requests, so that you can be successful at your organization. So number one is understanding in your budget who owns which line items. And what I mean by that is, and I'll show you a specific example here in just a second, is if you take something like identity and access management. Well, access management is a core security component, but it might be that IT is responsible for the identity and access management program, or the system, the underlying technology that supports that. So is that a budget request you need to make, or do you need to work with IT to make that budget request? Or is it some kind of hybrid? So for all the things that you need to get done, it's important that you pragmatically think through who owns that line item, and who do you need to collaborate with, influence, or whatever that might be to get it done. Also consider the official and unofficial channels of getting budgets approved. And official channels would be something defined in policy, like it's a step-by-step process. This is how you get a budget approved. It's owned by the CFO. There's budget limits. It's usually more clear, the official channels. But almost always there's unofficial channels. So maybe there's influencers within your organization. There's unofficial decision makers. There's people who there's folks that people really, really respect. Maybe there's processes to get emergency funds allocated versus planned funds allocated. So understand the official and unofficial channels, as well as the official and unofficial decision makers in your process. And I really recommend being very strategic about this. It might be like a plan that you design and start documenting it and doing walkthroughs with people and asking your peers how to navigate the situation. Otherwise, when it goes to get a budget approved or developing the budget, you might have blind spots that you otherwise don't know about. I also encourage you to think about timing and templates. So some companies have a budget season. So like maybe it's due before the end of the year, and it's really hard to get an exception in outside of that. Maybe there's a preferred template, so you have to use this exact Excel template to create your budget or a business case. There's probably different ways to manage one-time budgets, so like CapEx, capital expenditures. That's one big one-time expense versus something that's like a SaaS tool that's an operating expense that happens every single month into infinity. So understand how your organization treats those different kind of budget line items. And if you don't know what that stuff is, go to Wikipedia and Google it. This is like business fundamentals that you'll have to understand. And then again, understand budget limits, budget caps, approval limits. I've seen it often where, for example, maybe a vice president has a $100,000 approval limit, but anything that goes above that has to go to the CFO. And if you're unaware of those kind of conditions, you might find it surprising that when you go to make a really big acquisition for a key project, that there's additional steps that could delay your project. So the more that you understand about your own company's process and what is typical and how to navigate it officially and unofficially, the more successful that you'll be. And that gets us into the tactics of building a budget in of itself. So I'm going to pull up our budget template just to walk through some of it. So this is the budget template, and here in just a second, I'll give you the QR code and the link where you can download this for yourself if you'd like to. So this one's publicly available for you all. Couple of things I think about when I'm building a budget, and let me just tell you how I arrived at this one. So I'm going to go to the detailed budget section. So what I did is I built it out based on a couple publicly available resources. So I think NIST, CIS, SANS, a couple others had different versions of categories and line items that a typical security program will have. So you'll see things in here like, all right, there's a people section, there's a governance and risk management section, there is external audits, identity and access management. So there's a lot of different sections in here and a lot of line items. Two ways that you can use this is one, maybe you're just trying to do a tool inventory. Like, what's the type of things that I could buy if I wanted to, and do I have any gaps? And in all likelihood, you're not going to need or want all of these line items, but they're in here just for example purposes, so that you have a pretty good inventory as a starting point. And it'll be, like I said, a good exercise for you to walk through to think about, do you have all these tools? The other thing to think about is, especially if you're brand new, is like, who are you currently using? Because maybe you don't have a full inventory or understanding of your own tech stack, and this can be an opportunity for you to go through that and implement it as part of your gap assessment. Obviously, you're spending something on this. I just plugged 100,000 into every single line item, so that's not the actual cost of any of this. It's just a placeholder. And then I started thinking through, is this an OPEX or a CAPEX? And again, OPEX stands for operating expense. It means that something that's reoccurring, like every year or every month, is going to happen over and over again. Kind of like a utility bill, like it's always going to be there. CapEx stands for capital expenditure, and that's usually a one-time big expense. So if you're going to buy a car, that's a one-time expense, CapEx. Or if you're going to buy a piece of infrastructure, it's a one-time large expense. And organizations often treat those differently from an accounting perspective, so it's helpful sometimes to label that. And then there's the owner. Who owns this? And I think this is essential. You need to start thinking through, do you own it as a security team? Does your GRC team own it? Does IT own these? Is an engineering team, legal, et cetera? Who owns this line item? Or is it kind of shared and the ownership is unclear? Because you might find that your budget is much smaller than you thought, because most of this, for example, IT has in their budget. Whereas maybe you own specific line items, or maybe you don't even have a budget and you have to collaborate with another group for everything. So that's an important thinking model. And then just categorizing this, what's the section? How's this impacting your program? So go through this as a sanity check, as a budget template, and also you can use the dashboard I tried to create if you're presenting this to your team. So hopefully it's a helpful tool for you as you're thinking through building your own budget as part of your gap assessment. If you want to download that, you can use this QR code. Again, it's on risk360.com/whitepaper. Use this QR code. We have another one I didn't link to called the 90-day plan. So if you just kind of, what's my first 90 days as a CISO? Do the security assessment, do a budget, present it to the board. You can download all those templates there. They're also available individually. This budget template is right here in this QR code. So grab a screenshot of that. You can download that if you'd like. The other thing I think is helpful as a tool is what often happens is as you have different projects, you have to build a business case and present that business case. So maybe you want to use a new vendor, or you need to buy a new tool or whatever that might be, and you have to pitch that to get it approved. Or maybe you want to do an ROI calculation to make sure it actually even makes sense to do that project. So maybe you're considering some new security certification like SOC 2 or ISO, and you're thinking, does it make sense for our organization to spend the money on this? Will there be a return on investment? If you use that QR code, you can get the business case presentation template, as well as several ROI calculators where we've done the work for you. And even if it's not the perfect ROI calculator for you, you can adjust it a little bit and it'll work for you for many use cases. So another great resource that you can pick up from us. And hopefully if you've done this right, you've done your current state assessment, you got your maturity roadmap, you've built out a budget, hopefully you've done a great job aligning that to your business objective. So there's a reason that your company wants to invest in security. You know what that reason is, and you've aligned your program to support that business objective. You've built an accurate budget, you've communicated, everybody understands it, and you've gotten approved. And hopefully by doing these steps, you're really starting to build a great reputation for yourself and coming across as very credible. So that's what we want out of these steps so far. So once you've built that maturity roadmap, you've done your assessment, built your maturity roadmap, you're starting to build a budget, you're working through organizational change to get that stuff approved, you're building relationships internally. The next thing that you're probably going to need, in my experience, is the ability to present that plan to your leadership team. So you either need to present that plan to the board of directors, executive leadership team, peers, stakeholders, whoever it might be. So what's the process to present that plan? What are some best practices? So hopefully this will help you get what you're trying to do by presenting it is a couple different things. You're either trying to get feedback on it. So like, here's what I think I should do. I need some feedback from that. Maybe we're just informing someone. So, hey, this is what we're doing. I want you to know about it. Or maybe you're trying to get a decision. So you need to consider, by presenting your plan, what you want to get out of it. And after you know that, then you can better understand your objective for the presentation. I hope that makes sense. So that's what we want to start thinking through as we create this presentation and thinking about a desired outcome of the presentation. So how do you do that? What are the processes for creating this kind of presentation for your stakeholders? So before you start creating the presentation, I think the number one thing you need to do is start having meetings before the meetings. And this is an organizational change element where you're trying to understand what needs to be presented, who is it going to be presented to, what do they want out of it, what are my desired outcomes of the presentation. That way you can effectively curate the presentation to meet those objectives. I think this step gets skipped a lot. So when I'm advising clients, one of the things that, if this goes wrong, the way it goes wrong is that I'm working with like a security leader. We've done the maturity assessment. We're about to present it to the board, and we haven't done the work in advance to socialize the materials so that it sets the meeting up for success. So for example, a bad way to do this is to blindside everyone with net new information. They weren't aware a security assessment even happened. They don't know why that security assessment happened. It's hard for them to interpret the results because they haven't been briefed on it at all. As a consultant, often, if they don't know me, that's a problem because they're like, who is this guy or who is the security leader? We have no relationship. They don't understand what you want from them out of presenting the materials. So like, they don't know if you need a decision from them, if it's just an update. And they might even become adversarial during that meeting where they start pointing out things are incorrect or challenging why you made certain decisions along the way, especially if you're critiquing someone's work. So for example, if the CTO is part of the executive leadership team, you've assessed their systems and you're presenting all these gaps on their systems, but you don't have a strong relationship, these types of meetings are doomed to fail. So it's important to take inventory of all the people that you're going to have this meeting with before you create that presentation. And that's the point of meetings before the meetings. I'm just trying to emphasize, don't go straight into these thinking it's all about the presentation. It's really about all the work that happens before that meeting to have an effective readout of the maturity assessment. So take that into strong consideration as you go through this process. And that gets us to the tactics of actually creating a board-friendly presentation and presenting and communicating the results of all the hard work that we just talked about. Again, there's a template you can download. We have a security program maturity presentation that's a good template for you to use for the board of directors or different audiences. I'm going to cover that template right now so you'll see what's inside of it. I think it's a great starting point as you're trying to tell your story about what your organization's tried to accomplish. In terms of an agenda, this is like a loose agenda. I think almost universally works when it comes to presenting this type of material. I like to provide some background and context, go through business objective alignment, so make it very clear this is why the organization did it and this is what we're doing. Talk about, provide some summaries of the program maturity, maybe in dashboard view, just so they have a sense for, are we at a 0 or are we at a 10? Where are we at in terms of maturity and why? I like to be positive, so talk about some of the program's strengths, because every program is doing something good. And then talk about the biggest opportunities for improvement. present a timeline, and then talk about immediate next steps. Keep it pretty concise in terms of, what needs to happen right after this meeting to keep the ball moving, and maybe what are some of the longer term goals. So this is the basic agenda that I follow. You might find yourself needing to put appendices in here or other information, like maybe they want a detailed budget, maybe they want read aheads, maybe they want to know other stakeholders involved. There's other information that often a board might want, and that's why you need to have the meeting before the meeting. If they want some of those specifics, they communicate to you that there's some information they want in addition to the standard agenda. It's good to track that down. What I've also seen is different stakeholders have different needs. So maybe this is a baseline presentation that everyone is going to receive, but in an appendix, you're providing people separately via email or as a read ahead before the meeting some of those details that they have communicated along the way that they want, that you can address separately. And I've even done it in certain circumstances where different stakeholders get a different read ahead. So maybe the CFO is really concerned about the budget, so they want that detail. Whereas the CTO wants to know the effort that's going to impact their team, so we'll send that separately. So think about the different stakeholders, the unique needs of each of them, and what might be a good presentation in a group format. I have found that this presentation is good for that group format meeting with some separate read aheads. So in terms of the agenda, so background and context, what I typically would recommend that if you're going to present background and context, you do these 4 things. So what is the desired outcome of this meeting? So state that clearly in writing. So out of this meeting, this is what we want to get out of it. Here's the desired outcome. Again, is it to just inform everybody? Is it to get a decision from the group? Is it to get approvals? What is the reason for the meeting? Talk about what happened. So yeah, we did a security assessment. So what was that assessment and how was it done? So they'll probably need some of that background if you didn't cover that in the meeting before the meeting, just so they have confidence in the assessment results itself. And then again, just think proactively about anything else the audience might want to know, like how long did it take? How many people did you interview? Is there big revenue on the line? So what is the other stuff that the audience needs to know in way of background and context to make the rest of the presentation successful? Then I like to cover off on business objective alignment. I've given an example here. So for example, in this example, the company has a revenue target of 1 billion by 2025. So some aggressive growth targets. And then we know to hit those growth targets that our customers and prospects are requiring that we do SOC 2 and ISO 27001, or they can't do business with us. It's slowing us up in the contractual process. It's hurting our ability to get into certain markets, and that directly impacts our revenue growth targets. So that's the business objective. And then we talk about, well, the way we're going to help you do that is by helping you solve those gaps of SOC 2 and ISO to achieve that certification so that we can get into the regulated markets, so that we can get those contracts that are heavily valued, so that we can move faster during due diligence and sales. And putting it into business perspective helps the leadership team understand why they should be signing off on this initiative, because security in some way supports something that the business is trying to accomplish. So I always like to highlight that, especially in these group executive meetings. Again, I would vet this in advance. Don't just present this and make the assumption that you have it right. Present it in advance to trusted stakeholders. That way, when you present it to the group meeting, everybody's nodding their head and they're feeling really good about it. So then once you've set up a good background and context, you've talked about business objective alignment, you can dive into the security program maturity. I think there's 2 ways to present security program maturity. So one way I've seen this done is kind of the 0 through 5 scale. That's a maturity model scale. And then you say, hey, here's where we currently are. Here's our industry average, and here's what our goal is. So maybe our goal is 3, that's the green line. We're currently at 2.25 as an average, but hey, at least we're a little bit ahead of the industry average as 1.8. It's not very detailed, but if you're speaking to an audience who doesn't want to be in the weeds, they just kind of care conceptually where you're at and how do you compare and where are you going. I found this to be a really good model. The security assessment template that I provided earlier has this in it. So as you go through and click gap, no gap, you can create that. Phalanx also has the same thing. So a lot of good templates will have these capabilities of dashboards like this. The other view that I think is often helpful, and maybe you have to present both views or pick one or the other, is what I call the gap assessment view. So is it a gap or not a gap in terms of pursuing certification or in terms of the operating effectiveness of a given control? this is an example view that we put in a lot of our reports when we're doing like ISO internal audits or SOC 2 gap assessments or whatever it might be. It just breaks out all the categories and gives you a snapshot of what your total program assessment is. That's that top line. And then by category, what are the issues and not issues. And the reason I like this view is because if you see something that's really red or you're seeing a trend, it gives you an opportunity later in that presentation to zoom in on that specific section. Again, this exact screenshot that I have here can be created in Excel, which exists in the template that you can download, and it's also from Phalanx. This screenshot is actually directly from our dashboards in Phalanx. I'll show you real quick so you'll see. So if you're a RIS360 customer, we have all these dashboards. That's exactly where I pulled that from, was one of these. Cool. So that's presenting the maturity. Then after I've kind of summarized the program maturity, I like to go into program strengths. So what is the organization doing good? And I've actually been in some organizations where everyone is so cynical about it, it's hard to find something good. And that's an unfortunate situation, but almost always, just the fact that the organization has the appetite to do the assessment and move forward is good in of itself. So even if the only thing that you can emphasize is, hey, look, you guys are motivated to make some progress here, that's good, and I'm thankful for that. But otherwise, there's almost always something good to point out. So lead with that. Lead with something good. Talk about what people are doing, even if it's just an attitude or the governance structure or some tools they're using that are best practices. Just highlight a few of those things and give credit where credit is due. And then that typically sets you up effectively to talk about the program's opportunities. So what are those opportunities for improvement? In most situations, there might be 100 gaps, especially if it's a first-year program. Like, you might have gaps all over the place. And if you're presenting to a board of directors or an executive leadership team, it's not really helpful to get into the weeds and talk about all those gaps. So what you want to do here is either talk about the trends, like here are the themes we're seeing that are causing problems, or narrow it down to a few very important things. My rule of thumb is to try to do about 5. That might not be realistic. You're going to have to know your audience. If it's a board of directors, they'll probably be okay with 5, especially if they're thematic. If you're talking to a group of engineers who need the detail to do work, of course you're going to need to give them that detail. This is one of those opportunities where you're almost definitely going to need to provide a read ahead to different audiences so they understand how you arrived at this. But in general, stay thematic. Don't get too much in the weeds. I know as security professionals, we want to dive into the weeds often, but I would consider you to think about themes. So present those program opportunities. And then in terms of anticipating questions, a lot of them want to know what happens now? What's the timeline? When do we need to get this done? And maybe you need to get a certification by the end of the year, or maybe you've set some goals to do something in the next 18 months. Give them a high-level view of where you've been recently and where you're going next. So maybe it's like, hey, this is what we did our first 90 days. Here's the maturity assessment, the roadmap we build out. We're developing the roadmap now. And here's the key initiatives that we have going on over the next 6 to 12 months to accomplish this thing. And it just gives them a quick visual representation of the key work streams and gives them some confidence that you're working towards an important milestone. I tend to err towards simplicity, so you don't want 100 different things on here. Just keep it to those key work streams. And then lastly, I always recommend closing with a hook or an ask. So you need to have clear next steps. So what happens immediately following this meeting? Maybe the next step is, I'm going to be sending you all this information for approval, or I need a vote now to approve this policy or to move forward with a project. Or maybe I'm going to establish a project management meeting and I need everyone's buy-in on that. Whatever the immediate next step is to move the project forward, go ahead and highlight that as a next step. And then maybe think about kind of a longer term vision for what you want everybody, or how you want everybody to participate. So very simple model. That's the presentation. It's usually 10 slides or so, maybe some read aheads. You can download all that using that QR code right here to get that security program presentation, so you can think through articulating that to the leaders you need to articulate it to. And hopefully if you've done all that, again, you've aligned the business objectives, leadership's all on the same page, and it's very helpful to your organization. So talking about what we accomplished. So just a quick review. So we talked about choosing a framework. You should be good to go there, and how things to think about when you're choosing that framework. We talked about doing the maturity assessment itself. We reviewed how you could possibly do that in Excel, and then how maybe you could do that in a platform, some of the things to think about in terms of level of assurance. We talked about building the budget and provided an example of building that budget. And then we talked about how to present the plan to get everybody on the same page. So that's what we accomplished. Remember that this is a 4-part series. So we talked about planning and vision setting in some depth. This was the maturity roadmap. The next one is where we're really going to break out those key work streams. So if you want to operate your program, you want to build a sustainable program with key program pillars, et cetera, what does that look like? And then finally, how to get certified. Just to foreshadow a little bit for next webinar, when we talk about operating your program, again, we'll talk about those pillars. There's 7 key pillars of a security program that you can start thinking through, and I'll present that and give you a model to organize your own security program. There's about 15 separate work streams with different roles and responsibilities and different stakeholders involved in those work streams. So we'll talk about what those 15 work streams are and things you need to think about, and we'll give some tools and templates to operate that program and build policies around them and think about what they should look like. We'll talk about some ideas behind building a team, whether you have a very small team or you have the resources to build a large team, how you can build a team to handle those security program pillars and the different work streams and staffing, all of that. And then we'll talk about how you can monitor and measure the effectiveness of those different work streams so that you as a leader can get all the right information about the health of your security program to operate it. So that'll be the very next webinar, and then we'll talk about certification. So thank you guys for attending. Hopefully you have questions. Corey, if you'd like, I'd like to open it up for questions, see if anybody wants me to kind of revisit anything or if anything, any conversation sparked during today's webinar.
We've had a couple come through during the webinar. You guys please feel free to ask questions at this time. So we're going to start with the first one. Let's say our team is still managing assessments, findings, and projects through Excel. Is there a way to showcase and justify the purchase of using a GRC platform at a large company?
Yes, I'm trying to get to the template. So we have a template. So there's an ROI template in here. Here it is. So use this QR code. If you're trying to justify any decision, so like we're doing it in Excel, it's taking us a ton of hours, it's decentralized, we have version control issues, it's not giving us the right dashboards, we can't present the information management needs to be effective, all the things that are challenges when you're using something like Excel to do a complex project. I would recommend trying to think through those challenges, the return on investment if you're going to buy a GRC tool, and then being able to present that effectively, to the stakeholders. So download this. There's an ROI template in there that you can use that might help you think through some of those things, like how much time would you save by having a GRC tool? How much better communication would you have? How much better decisions would you be able to make by having a tool rather than Excel? And how does that translate into dollars and cents for your organization? Because you might find, a $1 GRC tool saves you $10 or makes you $10 more effective, and then effectively present that to your team. So there's a template here, and even if it's a different thing you're trying to present ROI or business case for, you can do that, but I would start with these templates right here.
All right, cool. Yeah, someone's actually asked to make sure the QR code's up so they can download it. The next question is, as a team navigates managing their maturity with a dwindling budget, what, in your experience, should they have as a healthy training budget for a large enterprise team?
I'll tell you what we do. So when it comes to training budgets, I think of 2 things. Training typically consists of 1, the stuff that your firm needs them to do as a normal course of business. So it's like, for example, you have to maintain a certification for my business to continue to do business. And so those are table stakes. They have to be in the budget or your business can't operate. So that might be, for example, maybe they need a certain designation to support your customers. So build that into the budget. That's table stakes. And then in addition to that, there's like an L&D budget to help them progress in their career. So when I think about that kind of budget, I start thinking about stuff like, like maybe $2,500 a person, something like that, where they can go and get those certifications, they can attend courses, things like that. So what I see out in the industry is something like $2,500 per person. That seems to be a healthy training budget on top of the table stakes kind of budget for them to continue. Hopefully that's helpful, Corey.
Yeah, that's good. I believe we're at time. I think that's the last question that we have too. Thank you all for attending today. Christian, great content as usual. And it will be a follow-up email sent out to all of you guys if you want to rewatch it or share it with colleagues tomorrow at the exact same time. So you guys have a good day.
Thanks, everybody.